Well, good morning. Welcome. We're going to talk a little JavaScript here this morning. JavaScript UI is one of these spaces that to say it's fertile ground these days, I think would be a pretty radical understatement. I think there's a decent chance that a new framework will probably be created while we're in this room here today. That seems to kind of be the evolution of JavaScript. And if not a full-on new thing, at least somebody's going to put out a new version. And what's really fascinating is to see how similar a lot of these different frameworks actually are, and we can have a really interesting argument about the difference between MVC and MVP and throw out a few other acronyms and letters and whatnot. We're all trying to get to the same place. Now the challenge for us when we're working on our projects is to make sure we're choosing good platforms, because we don't want to be on a legacy platform. And in the same breath, though, we can't be changing things every few months. That doesn't benefit our business customers. I had a student last year, we were talking, and she said, you know, my application has 4 different UI frameworks in it now. 4 different UI frameworks. And she fully admitted that this was not a sustainable thing. This was not a good thing for their application. But they felt like they needed to allow developers to keep playing with new things. And so that's another sort of action that we need to guard against, because we like to go after new stuff. That's part of what makes this interesting, an interesting industry to work in. But we have to, again, be very conscious of the fact that we're delivering business value to somebody. So how do we avoid that while still keeping things fresh and new and staying ahead of the curve? And more importantly, how do we do this? Because this is a constant. I can't tell you what we're going to be talking about at a conference like this in 2 or 3 years. I wish I knew. I really do. I can feel pretty confident in saying it's going to be different than the stuff we're talking about this year. So if you take anything out of the next 50 minutes, I hope it's at least a general idea, framework, some concepts on how you evaluate any new technology, because I guarantee you are going to do this repeatedly throughout your career. Now, we'll obviously use React and Angular as a way of discussing that framework, but that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here, is more how do we evaluate the inevitable new technologies that we're going to face throughout our career. Now, the hard thing for a lot of us is to avoid the constantly chasing new things. And honestly, this is a big reason why I'm in this industry. I like change. I like to learn new things. It keeps it interesting and fresh, and it's fun. But it is a pretty constant sort of churn, and it's very tempting for many of us to constantly be going after that new thing and to sort of lose focus on developing skills in the current thing that I'm working on. And I know a lot of us have this strong desire to be on or near the bleeding edge of technology. That's where a lot of the fun stuff happens to be. And frankly, it's a key part of being successful as a software professional. I had a friend of mine we've been having this conversation over the last couple of years, and he keeps kind of saying, you know, Nate, don't you feel like it's time for you to kind of get into management? You know, don't you think you're kind of at that point in your career where, you know, you can be a multiplier and all this kind of stuff? He says, you know, when I was about your age, you know, I knew how to do my job cold, and so getting into management was great because I could really, you know, move the needle. I thought, well, the difference between my industry and yours, John, is things are constantly changing in mine. I don't think I've ever sat back and said, well, I know how to do this cold. This is all so easy now. Because by the time you get to that comfort level, there's 3 or 4 or 5 new things that you have to add to the plate. Now, I do think as a society, as a culture, as a tribe, we have a tendency to get bored probably a little more quickly maybe than the average person. And so I think that that's part of what drives us to sort of constantly be playing with new things. But we need to be very conscious of the fact that our software exists in the scope of an overall business. And just playing with React or Angular or Ember or Elm or whatever happens to be the next thing doesn't necessarily help us deliver business value. And by the same token, if we're always playing with new things, we're probably not delivering on the features that our business is depending on us to deliver. So eventually, we just have to commit to something. We have to say, all right, we've done our due diligence, we've tried various things, we feel pretty good about this, we know things are going to change, but we have to make a decision, we have to go down this path and develop at least a certain amount of expertise in that particular space. Now, one of the things that's been really interesting to me throughout my career is to realize that it's called the bleeding edge for a reason. The bleeding edge is where you bleed. You know, there's this old adage that you know who the pioneers are because they're the ones who have the arrows in their back. I mean, you think about the first time you're playing with a point X something of a framework, there's a lot of rough edges. It may have a lot of promise, but boy, those first few months, maybe even first years, are a really painful experience. And then, of course, as it evolves and as it changes and as it breaks your application, you got to deal with all of that. And maybe Stack Overflow helps, maybe it doesn't because it's so new that nobody's even asked these questions yet. So as software people, we need to have a strategy here. We need to be thinking about this consciously so that we can make sure that our projects don't end up in a situation where we've got a whole bunch of dead platforms and we can't retain talent, we can't attract talent, we can't move things forward. But we have to do that understanding that if we're constantly changing, constantly churning, we find ourselves in a situation where our poor little application has 4 or 5 different front-end technologies and it's a maintenance nightmare. Now, I think the interesting question from our standpoint is how do we evaluate new things? What do we look at? And this is a very subjective thing, quite frankly. I'd love to give you this very objective rubric that you can use on all your projects. It doesn't work that way. There's a lot of different things that you can use to evaluate a piece of technology, and I like to refer to these essentially as litmus tests. Now, I'm going to walk through some of the ones that matter to me. You might agree with some of them, you might disagree with others, you might have other things you think are interesting. That's perfectly normal, perfectly fine. But what you want to do when you set out on one of these paths is to ask yourself, what matters to us? What's important to us? What do we need to be successful using this product? Now, one of the first things that I look at when I'm evaluating a new piece of technology is the documentation. Now, one of the most obvious questions to ask, of course, is there any at all? You go back far enough in the open source space, the documentation was the source code. Documentation was like the last thing to be added. It'd be a great way for you to contribute to a project in the early days, but generally that was the last thing that anybody cared about in an open source project because they were scratching their own itch, and the usual response was, well, just read the code, it's all in the code. Now, what's interesting is to see how much that has flipped in the last 15 years. Nowadays, you put out a new open source library, if there's not a pretty good getting started guide, people aren't going to pick it up. And I'll tell you from my standpoint, I don't have the time anymore to dive deep into the source code of something in order to do that evaluation. I need that getting started guide. I need to have a good ramp-up experience. Is the documentation clear? Is it concise? Is it well written? Does it make sense to you? More importantly, is it actually up to date? If a new version of the framework, the library has come out, has the documentation been updated along with that? Or is that a lagging indicator? Now, what's really interesting, and this is a hard thing to judge early on, a lot of frameworks may do a really good job at getting you started, and so there's a good kind of ramp experience, but then you get a little further down the path and you're like, oh geez, I've got nothing now other than what I can find via Google. So that's something we have to consider, is that our needs are going to change from the first couple of months to the first couple of years. Is this framework, library, et cetera, going to grow with me or not? It's very important these days to look at the community. And so how big is this community relative to others? This can be one of the best sort of delineators, especially in the open source space, when we're trying to decide between one framework or another that do very similar things. If one has a larger community, that can be a pretty good indicator that that might be a better place for us to be. Is it a thriving community? Is it a growing community? Or is it starting to kind of wither a bit on the vine? Now, especially if I'm new to something, one of the things that I'm very interested in is the openness, the friendliness of that community. Now, again, most of the open source community tends to be pretty friendly, but it's really interesting to see how different communities react to new people. Some communities are very open, very welcoming. They want you to be part of the community. They go out of their way to make you part of the community. And others have a very different attitude, which is mostly this is my sandbox, go away. So that's something that's very important for us to understand and try to get a sense of, am I going to be welcomed into this community or not? Now, one of the things we can try to figure out as we look at this community as well is what does it value? And do those values align with what we're trying to do? Some frameworks, some open source communities are very, very much into testing and clean code and quality and continuous delivery pipelines, all that good stuff. Others seem to, frankly, elevate obfuscation and look what I can do in 2 lines of code, and isn't this amazing? I can't read it 2 weeks later, but boy, that's really impressive what I did 2 weeks ago. It can be really interesting to look at committer diversity. Who is committing to this project? Who is actually part of that? Is it all just one big company, and is every single commitment coming from someone who works at company X? Or is it a thriving open community with literally dozens, if not hundreds, of contributors all around the world? I get a little nervous if every single commit is coming from someone that's got the same email address. That gives me a little bit of pause. Because now I have to ask myself, is this framework strategic for that company? And is it going to be strategic for the long term? We've all seen instances of frameworks, libraries, open source projects that come along. They've got a big company behind it. Everyone's very excited about it. And then a couple years later, that company has moved on, and now we're sitting here going, geez, we don't have that support that we thought we were going to have. So it's important, and especially in the case of Angular and React that both have large corporate parents, what happens if one of those corporate parents decides this is no longer strategic for us, we're going to put our resources into something else? Is that a death knell for us? Now, in some cases, it isn't. The community is large enough that even if a corporate backer leaves, no big deal. Maybe not ideal, obviously, but we can move on. In other instances, that's a significant, if not complete, portion of the development team for that project. And now, instead of having 20, 30, 100 people working on it, there's 3. That's going to have an impact on the trajectory that that framework can take. The code base is a great indicator. Now, I said earlier, I'm not a big fan of having to dive into the code base just to get started, but at some point you want to look at the code to get a sense of how is it written. Is this good, clean code? Is this something you'd be proud of if you wrote it? Is it readable? This is another really important aspect of this. If you can't understand the code, that's probably going to come back to haunt you at some point. Now, hopefully you never run into that problem that forces you down into the code base, but at some point there's a pretty good chance you're going to have to dig into it. So I think it's worth it in your evaluation to do that preemptively and give yourself a sense of, does this make sense for me, to me or not? I'm a big believer in tests, so I get very nervous when I see projects that have no tests or very few tests or just one big smoke test. So I like to see a good set of unit tests, integration tests, whatever the team happens to have done. By the same token, I want to look at the impact of forking the repo if I had to. Now again, that's a last resort, at least to me. Now I know some people who feel like that's the way to go, and in order to get yourself out of issues with dependencies and whatnot, you go ahead and just take the repo, clone it into your world, and then you can own it from that point forward. I've spent most of my career in big enterprise companies where that's probably not something we're comfortable with, probably not going to do that anytime soon. But this is something we want to consider. If I had to, if that was my last resort, would I feel comfortable taking this code and working on it myself if I had to? Is it testable? Is it easy for me to test my code if I use this framework? Or am I now forced down a route where I have to use some other custom testing framework that I may or may not have any expertise in? How do I feel about that? Does the framework actually encourage testing? Or does it make it almost impossible to do? Also important for us to look at the update history. So you take a look at a project and you say, all right, when was the last commit? Now, just because the last commit was a month ago or 6 months ago doesn't necessarily mean this is a dead project. We have to sort of delineate between this is a project that no one is investing in anymore. It's dead end. People have moved on to something else. If so, I need to figure out what that thing is. But it might also just be an indicator that this is a mature project. At a certain point, I hope the churn slows down. That's especially the case in this JavaScript space. If you think about how much change we've seen in the JavaScript UI world over the last 5 years, it's been pretty crazy. And it makes it very difficult for us to sort of pick something, work with something, keep our projects up to date. This is something I've thought a lot about. What pace can my project consume change from a framework? That's going to differ based on your projects. Speaking of maturity, is this a mature framework? Do I feel comfortable rolling this into production or not? I've seen some folks who are very interested in always getting on the bleeding edge. They want to be on the 0.02 of a project, and that's great if you can consume that. But we might want to wait for things to stabilize a bit, get to a point where, yep, we feel pretty comfortable with this. Now, I know some organizations that flat out say, we won't accept anything that's below 1.0. Now, I do think that's a little silly because if you look at some of the version numbers, they're kind of all over the map. I mean, look at Node. For how many years was Node a 0.10 dot something product? You know, were you still comfortable using it? Probably. And then after we had a little kumbaya moment, all of a sudden we're 4.0 something. So these numbers are somewhat arbitrary, but we need to understand what's our appetite for that. How frequently can we accept those changes? Now, especially in this JavaScript UI space, things are evolving rapidly. That's not going to slow down anytime soon. How do we feel about that? Does that align with what our projects can handle or not? As we look out into the future, are there breaking changes coming or not? That was certainly a big issue in the Angular space, the whole Angular 1 to Angular 2 issue. Now, hopefully that'll be less of a problem moving forward with Angular 4 and beyond, or I guess we're just calling it Angular now. Forget about the numbers, that's fine. But what does my upgrade path look like? How do I get from here to there? And by the same token, how quickly are those versions coming out? How quickly am I losing support? At what point do I have to upgrade? This is a very real problem for a lot of our organizations. Just because Angular is coming out with a new version every 6 months doesn't mean my project can consume a new version of Angular every 6 months. That might not align with my business needs. Different organizations have different cadences that they can work at. I mean, obviously, we'd all love to be in the world where push button goes to production, everybody's happy, everything works, it's glorious. But for a number of organizations, that's just not practical. We're just not there yet. We don't have that maturity. We don't have that discipline yet. So to take a framework that's constantly going to be changing might not work for us. I'm deeply interested in stability. As an architect, this is important to me. I don't want to be choosing frameworks that are going to be causing my developers pain. So when a new version of something comes out, is it generally pretty stable or not? Or when a new version comes out, is there 3 straight weeks of patches that I now need to consume and somehow work into my projects? That can be the death knell to a lot of people. That can leave a very bad taste in people's mouths when they go through all the effort, they do an upgrade, and then everything breaks, and they get a patch, and then everything breaks, and they get a patch, and everything breaks, and you spend weeks in this churn state. So another way of thinking about this is, how comfortable would you be putting a new version of this into prod? How much time would you need with it to feel confident that, yes, this is going to work for our customers? We're not going to take down the world. Extensibility is an important consideration these days. Frameworks are not Swiss Army knives. They don't do everything. So we need to ask ourselves, if I needed to add something, how hard would that be? Is there some kind of a plugin model that I could use to extend this, take advantage of this, or am I fundamentally at the mercy of the committers? This was an interesting thing to see in sort of the JavaScript widget world. Kind of the YUI approach of, well, here's what it is. If you like it, great. If it doesn't work for you, that's too bad. To the jQuery, it's a plugin model. You can go ahead and extend it all you want. That's something we need to consider as well. How about support? I worked at a big company for a lot of years, and this was a real issue for us. This made it a lot harder for me to get a framework approved if I couldn't find a support contract somewhere. Now, I would argue in most cases, those support contracts weren't worth what we were paying for them, but it gave our management a level of comfort that they knew they could pick up the phone, they could send an email, whatever, and that in theory, someone would answer on the other end. Now, most of us are pretty comfortable finding this kind of help online, and that's usually pretty solid. Stack Overflow can be an excellent source here, obviously. And by the way, that's a pretty good way to do an evaluation on some of these frameworks. Take a look at Stack Overflow. What do you see? Does that make you happy or not? How do you feel about what you're finding on Stack Overflow? Training is a really important part of this. I had a manager early on in my architecture career who said to me, Nate, you don't get any points for selecting a JavaScript framework. That's table stakes. I expect that you can do an evaluation on a new framework, you can make a coherent choice, you can bring that into the organization. What I'm evaluating you on is your ability to make the organization successful with that framework. A big part of that for a lot of us is training. Can we get any training on this particular framework? What does it mean if I can't? If I can't find pre-existing training, am I comfortable building it myself, delivering it myself? I've done that throughout my career. Sometimes that's our only choice. Vitally important that we consider the hiring decisions these days. If I choose this framework and I put a job post out with that particular framework on it, am I going to get hits or not? Are people actually going to respond to that or not? When I see the resumes that are coming into my company, what am I seeing on it? Is it this framework or is it something else? This was a partial reason why my organization several years ago switched from prototype to jQuery, because so many of the people that we were hiring had significant jQuery experience. And after a while, it becomes much more practical to just change to jQuery than try to teach a whole bunch of jQuery developers prototype, especially because they just grumble the whole time. This is how I do it in jQuery. So eventually you just sort of tap out and say, okay, fine, we'll move to jQuery. It is important to at least consider our developers' feelings on these things. What are they interested in? What do they want to learn? What do they want to play with? I have seen people make bad choices and have teams just disappear almost overnight as people decide this isn't what I want to work on anymore. I'm not interested in this. This isn't helping me grow. And do not underestimate how personally some people can take these decisions. It shouldn't be. It's not about me versus you. But this is something we have to consider. What do my developers want to do? What's interesting to them? My previous organization, we did an evaluation on Angular several years ago, and we also did Backbone at the same time. And what was really interesting is we fundamentally ended up choosing Angular, and I was talking to the guy who did the evaluation, and he told me that he actually preferred Backbone, that he would have preferred we choose Backbone, but essentially the corporate appetite was more towards Angular. More people were interested in Angular, wanted to go in that direction, so okay, we won't fight against that. So you can look at what your developers are actually interested in. Are people clamoring for this kind of training? Are they clamoring to play with that stuff? Do they want to be on those projects? Or are they actively trying to find their way onto literally any other project than that? Now, another way of sort of summing up a lot of that basically is corporate fit. Now, I can't give you a definitive answer to this one because I don't know your organization well enough. But I can tell you that different companies have different thoughts on a lot of these issues. I've worked in a lot of companies where if you couldn't find a support contract, it was a non-starter. Didn't matter how great the framework was, didn't matter how amazing the library was. If you couldn't find a support contract somewhere, they were not interested in it. So that's something we need to consider. Am I going to be rolling a rock uphill if I try to bring this framework in, or does it actually mesh up pretty nicely with our corporate values? If I bring this in, am I fundamentally making a breaking change in the organization? Am I going to have to deal with some interesting political blowback on that? This is actually something I experienced directly about 6 months ago when I started bringing React into my last company. We had a lot of Angular, and so there was some pushback on React because we already have Angular, why do we need React? So I had to navigate those waters, try to keep people comfortable that I'm not saying you can't use Angular, I'm just saying we should have another option, and I think this is what that option should be, and here's why I think that option makes sense. Usage matters quite a bit. Is there anyone else out there using it? That should give you pause as well. Are other companies embracing it? Now, be cautious here. This can be a bit of a trap because a lot of people kind of run into this, well, we can't do it unless everyone else is doing it. It's very much that lemming approach. We want to avoid being lemmings if at all humanly possible. All right, so how would I apply that to Angular versus React? Well, the first thing that I have to say, guys, is this is a pretty subjective thing. I would like to tell you that I can give you this nice little mathematical formula and out the other end will spit the one true answer for you. That's just not how it works. So you may look at what I'm doing here today and say this is too informal for me, and that's perfectly fine. You can have a more formal approach. I've done this throughout my career as well. You can essentially do what I call the spreadsheet approach. You put your options across the top. You put your criteria down the left. You can go ahead and weight your criteria if you wish. Now, I'm a big fan of using Harvey balls for these kinds of discussions. That's these partially filled to all the way filled in little circles, because this tends to resonate better, especially with a non-technical audience, and you will definitely have to get this past a non-technical audience at some point. Now, I prefer this to a numeric scale because people disagree on numbers all the time. I was looking at an evaluation that a peer of mine had done where he kept flipping his scales. So in some parts of his evaluation, a 1 was good, and in others, a 5 was good. And it made it really confusing as you were going through his evaluation to try to figure out, well, wait, he gave this a 5. Does that mean this is a good thing or a bad thing? Everybody pretty much understands what an empty circle means versus a filled-in circle. Now, it's still pretty subjective, but at least everybody understands what we're talking about. We don't have to argue about 1 versus 5, which is better. So essentially, we use something like that to say this matched pretty closely to our criteria or it doesn't. My experience, very effective way to do that. Now, What criteria should you use? How should they be weighted? That's completely up to you. And understand that you can use both the criteria you select and the way you weight them to move things in a specific direction. I've seen that throughout my career. People have a preconceived notion of what they want the answer to be, and so they make sure that they get that answer by changing the inputs. Now, the other part of this that's fascinating is some people get very antsy as soon as you try to compare Angular and React because they say, you know what, they're not the same thing. This is apples and oranges. Angular is a framework. React is a library. Ergo, you cannot compare the two. Now, I would argue that's just a very pedantic thing, but fine. I get it. We're developers. We argue about tabs versus spaces. Fine. So if we look at the documentation, I would argue in both cases, we've actually got really solid documentation here. It's quite extensive. They've got good tutorials. I could make the argument that Angular is maybe a little bit more in-depth. You know, maybe give them a slight nod there. But again, we've got good frameworks, good documentation, very easy to get your head wrapped around it, get up to speed relatively quickly. Again, these frameworks understand that most of us don't have the time to immerse ourselves in the source code for 6 months before we can be productive. We need to be able to put this stuff on a project pretty quickly. Now, in terms of community, I really appreciate that React has a code of conduct for its contributors, and they are going out of their way to try to increase committer diversity. Now, you can make an argument that the Angular community is larger. This depends a bit on which particular version of Angular we're talking about. If you kind of add everything up between both versions or both sort of flavors of Angular, you're looking at about 3 times as much forking as with React. I don't know that's necessarily the best metric to use here, but if we look at the repositories in terms of stars, watches, et cetera, it's actually pretty close. Now, again, a lot of this depends on whether we're talking about sort of the AngularJS versus Angular.io code bases, but if you kind of take it as a whole entity, they're actually pretty similar, all things considered. In terms of committer diversity, I do have a bit of a pause here because both of these libraries, frameworks have a large company behind it. Now, thankfully, in both situations, we're seeing commits come from all over the world. This isn't just a Facebook thing and just a Google thing. We're talking lots and lots of contributors. Not everybody's email address happens to end in Google or Facebook. I think we've got more than 1,000 on the React side, more than 1,500 on the Angular side. That's pretty impressive. So clearly there's lots of energy there. I would feel pretty comfortable in both situations if either Facebook or Google decided this was no longer strategic for them. I don't feel like that'd be the death knell for either framework. I think the communities are large enough at this point. They've got enough of sort of momentum there that they would just continue to move on. I really, really appreciate that React has a great how to contribute page. That's a really intimidating thing for a lot of us. I think many of us have had the desire to contribute and just didn't know where to start. And so I give them a lot of credit for actually going out of their way to make that simpler. They go so far as to actually have a great set of first bugs. So you're not going to try to pick something that turns out to be super complicated, but you didn't know that because you didn't have enough experience yet. Now here's some nice things that, sort of low-hanging fruit that you can go ahead and take a shot at. Now I do think React does a better job of that than Angular. Although again, if you look at it from sort of the total cumulative effect, Angular does have more total contributors, so obviously that's not a massive impediment for most people. I think it's really important to look at the code bases here, and frankly, in both situations, we've got some really clean code, really well-written code. If you're trying to understand how do I write good JavaScript, spending some time in either of these code bases is going to give you some good ideas. On the testability side, this is one of the things that really stood out to me with Angular when they first came on the scene. Testing was sort of paramount. It was a core part of what they were trying to do right from the beginning. I would give them a lot of credit for that. There's an awful lot of documentation dedicated to testing. It is clearly integrated into the community. It's an expectation of the community. I'm not saying it's not there for React. React is definitely much more JavaScript-centric than Angular. And as a part of that, we've got a rich set of JavaScript testing tools at our disposal, and there's been a number of utilities that have been built over the last couple of years to facilitate testing and working with React. So the thing I like about React, it allows you to work with whatever testing tool you like. It has no preconceived notions there. I've worked with some JavaScript frameworks in the past that made it really difficult unless you chose to use their preferred testing tool. So both React and Angular do a pretty good job of saying, you know what, we're agnostic here. We just want you to write tests. In terms of update history, if you look at both repos, we're seeing lots of regular updates. That shouldn't be too surprising. Now, I think some people were taken aback a bit by the whole Angular 2 controversy, as it were. I think a lot of that was noise. I think a lot of that was the Angular community figuring that, if we sort of lob something out there, we'll actually be able to move further than if we sort of started with where we ended up. So I don't necessarily think that was a terrible thing. But I do know that for some organizations, that was a bit of a showstopper for them. They're like, wait, we can't handle this. We finally got a lot of expertise in the Angular 1 space. We're just not interested in the churn it's going to take for us to get to Angular, or we just call it Angular now. I don't think that's going to be as big a deal moving forward. Famous last words. I guess we'll find out. I mean, who knows? Maybe in another 6 months or a year, they'll decide to make massive changes again. I guess we'll see. I do appreciate that they are actually committed to a deprecation phase. As a longtime Java developer, I learned that deprecated was a keyword that just meant we will never remove this from the library ever. So it's nice to see that other frameworks actually take that at its face value, that no, we are going to get rid of this at some point in the future. Now, where I do think we've got a bit of a double-edged sword with Angular is this upgrade cadence. Now, for some of us, taking changes every 6 months is not going to be a big deal. I think back to my last organization, large enterprise company, changing something that core every 6 months was going to be challenging. Now, we had a corporate ethos that said we always wanted to be at worst n-1 on a framework, but I knew lots of instances where we were n-2, n-4, and it's difficult in some cases to convince our business folks that, yes, I need to spend the time and money and effort on this thing that you're not really going to notice, but I need to do it to keep everything clean. Now, in terms of maturity, this is a bit of a toss-up. I guess I would give a slight edge to Angular on this particular sort of stretch. Angular 2, I would argue, is pretty widely used at this point. Angular 4.2 just came out 2 weeks ago, I think, something like that. Now, if you're really, really interested in version numbers, obviously React's is higher. Although, again, version numbers are to a certain extent a random string, so I wouldn't be super concerned about that. React certainly suffered from an awful lot of churn early on in its career. That has clearly started to slow down now, which is good. Because again, most of us just don't have the engineering resources to constantly be changing and tweaking and upgrading and fixing. We actually have to deliver capabilities. In terms of stability, I give Angular a bit of a nod here. I think their updates are very methodical, very predictable, very understandable. This is what the cadence is going to be. You may not be able to accept things at that cadence, but at least you have an idea going into it. This is what it's going to feel like. And again, I don't think we're going to see major issues, certainly on the minor upgrades. Again, as we do the major, potentially breaking changes, that might make a little different story. Where I do think this hurts React a bit is the fact that you really need to stitch a few different libraries together to truly get everything you need out of React. And of course, every one of those libraries moves at whatever pace that library moves. And in many instances in this world, that's very rapid. I got a new laptop a few months ago, and I'm still struggling to get some things set up on it because what I had working on my old laptop, I can't quite figure out the magic number of versions and the right versions and what order and everything to get it all to work on this one. It's very frustrating. We've been working on some stuff on my current job, and that's one of the things that we've been discussing is dependency management is hard. It just doesn't matter what language we're talking about. It seems like it's a little more painful maybe in JavaScript, but that might just be because that's where our current pain happens to be. So I'd give Angular a little bit of an edge here. Again, a slight edge, not a massive edge. In terms of extensibility, Angular goes out of their way to make sure they work with other libraries, and you can certainly swap things in or out at your heart's content. I don't think many people do that necessarily, but you are free to change an awful lot of what is in Angular. Now, React comes at it from the other side, which says, well, we're going to let you choose what you want to pair with this. And you can roll whatever you want. You can bring in different pieces, and that's perfectly fine. That does, of course, mean that you have to go find those things, bring them together, stitch them together, figure out if they'll actually work together. Now, one of the things I enjoy about React is how darn easy it is to build components. It fits my eye, just from my background in what I've done with jQuery and things before that. It's very natural. I have a hard time kind of getting into the Angular way of thinking. When I've tried to do Angular in anger, I mostly just sit there and stare at it and say, I could do this in 2 lines of jQuery, and how do I do it the Angular way? Now, I'm sure if I actually sat down and spent 6 months programming in Angular, I'd get over that hump. But at least the toes that I've dipped in the water, React fits my eye better, but that's an terribly subjective thing. And I'm confident many people would violently disagree with me on that point. In terms of support, we've got massive open source projects, so plenty of results out there. If you do a quick search on Google, you will find many, many hits for both projects. Interestingly enough, Stack Overflow has far more Angular questions. And my first reaction was, oh, that's great. There's lots of information on Stack Overflow about Angular. And then my next thought was, well, wait a minute. Why are people asking more questions about Angular? Does that mean it's harder? Does that mean people are running into more issues? Does that mean more people are using it? I don't quite know how to feel about the fact that there is a demonstrably larger number of Angular questions than React questions. So I guess I take that one with a pretty heavy grain of salt. In terms of training, I've found training examples for both quite easily. There are online versions, there are in-person versions, there are books, there are blogs, there are tutorials, etc. I feel very comfortable in either environment that I could get support there if I needed to get a team spun up. In terms of hiring, interestingly enough, you find a lot more Angular in job posts. I'm not terribly surprised by that when I consider who actually writes most of these job posts. I can remember 5 years ago seeing posts come out, must have 10 years iOS and Android experience. It's like that's not possible unless you got a time machine, but all right, cool. So I guess I would give Angular a bit of an edge here, quite frankly. Now that said, I get frustrated when people try to tell me that my developers can't learn new things. My developers can't pick this up. Oh, my developers already know this, they can't learn the next thing. I think that's insulting to developers. Because pretty much every developer I've ever worked with is very adept at learning new things. The first language you learn is the hardest, and then everyone after that gets easier because you have more things to compare it to. So to me, that's kind of a non-starter. It's a bit of a red herring, and people say, oh, my folks can't pick this up. I just sort of get mad when people say that. Corporate fit. God, I wish I had a good answer for you here, but I don't. This depends an awful lot on your organization. I can find plenty of examples of both being used at very comparable corporations, big companies, little companies. There's no one size fits all here. Now, I can tell you that at my last company, this was one of the debates we had, though, was we had chosen Angular. Well, a group had chosen Angular. We had some other teams that wanted to use React. And so one of the things that I was tasked with by my manager was to come up with sort of that evaluation, the comparison, when would you use one over the other? Because we were starting to get teams coming to us saying, but we want to use React on our next project. And so we, as architects, had to have an answer for them. Now, one of the things that's definitely something you should consider here, React lets you make a lot of choices. Angular is very opinionated and makes a lot of choices for you. Is it easier in your organization to manage one library that's made a lot of choices for you, or would you rather have a whole bunch of choices left up to you? So in some companies, if you have to go and get every single version of every single library and every single dependency approved, that can take months. And so picking something like Angular can actually really simplify this because it's sort of a one-stop shop. And one of the things that I had to deal with in my last organization was the fact that we already had a significant amount of Angular in the company. So when my team started asking about React, it was a bit of a hem and haw from my standpoint as an architect because, well, from a corporate standpoint, we've already got a lot of expertise in this other library. So help me understand why you'd want to use this over that. And so that was, again, one of the things that I had to come up with was when would we use React versus when would we use Angular. Now, in terms of usage, look at their creators. Are there larger properties out there? I mean, Google, Facebook, obviously these things are getting used all day, every day, massive properties, lots of hits, lots of different people playing with it. And so usage here is pretty much, I would say, a dead even heat. Now I went ahead and sort of jammed all that into a nice handy table and then used my wonderful Harvey balls to try to compare that down. Now, I end up fundamentally giving a slight edge here to Angular, all things considered. But it is a very slight edge. And I would argue that basically every point that I've made, we could come up with a counterpoint to say, no, I really think this is a better answer. Now, again, I'd love to be able to give you the one true answer. I can't. I don't know what that is for you. It depends on a lot of very subjective things that we would have to have a conversation about. I can tell you that in my last organization, I had a lot of people that loved Angular. And if I even brought up React, they got very upset with me. And I had other folks who hated Angular and were begging me to use React. So it's a trade-off. All I ask is that you please avoid the I have 4 UI frameworks on my project. Fundamentally, we have to pick one and run with it and see what happens. So again, all things in, I give a very slight nod to Angular. But I would argue that, again, we could come up with a different set of answers if we had a conversation about it. This is just one man's opinions, which of course leads us to the million-dollar question. Which one should you choose? The longer I do this, the more I realize there are 3 answers that work for every question in computer science. 42, it's the geek check, love that one. Another layer of indirection. Every one of our problems can be solved with another layer of indirection. But of course, my all-time personal favorite, it depends. Now, I know that's a bit of a cop-out, and I get that. And when someone says to you, it depends, your next question should be, well, that's great. What does it depend on? Because that's really the important part of this. I understand these are subjective things, but what should I be looking at? All right, what's your project need? What are you looking for? In this instance, React and Angular are very different beasts. React is the view. Angular is the view, the controller, everything in between, and it's wiring all that together for you. What are you looking for? I think it's really important to take a step back and ask yourself, am I trying to make a corporate level decision here? Am I trying to make the decision for my company? Or is this just the decision for my project? Those might have very different answers. If I'm trying to make a corporate decision, that might move one way or the other, but for this particular project, the right answer is X. The only way you're truly going to come to a good concrete answer here is to do your homework. You're going to have to do a little bit of work, do a little bit of research. There are dozens, hundreds, thousands of comparisons on the web. The last time I did a Google search, I found more than 500,000 hits. I strongly advise that you wade through some of them. However, be highly aware of the dates on those comparisons. Be highly aware of the versions that they're comparing. It probably doesn't do you a whole lot of good to compare Angular 1 to an old version of React. That's unlikely what you're going to be using on a new project today. So you have to understand the train is moving along very quickly. Take a step back and ask yourself, does this make sense? Is this actually an accurate comparison or not? One of the things that I appreciate about Angular, it makes an awful lot of decisions for you. You choose Angular and a whole bunch of stuff comes along for the ride. In general, React says, that's cool, we're going to need a starter kit though to truly use me. And at least one of the comparisons I read, the guy said, I've written 2 starter kits myself. Now, one of the things I really like about React, though, is it's very Unix-like in the sense that you take a bunch of small tools that do one thing and do one thing very, very well, and you wire them together. And it allows you to make the choices that make sense for you. So you can pick the best of breed in these various tools and wire together the toolkit that makes sense for you on your projects. The other side of that, though, of course, is you have to make that choice. You have to actually look at it and say, does this make sense for us or not? Now, Angular, on the other hand, says, nope, I'm a very opinionated thing. You go ahead and pick me, and I'll choose a whole bunch of stuff for you. One-stop shop. Another way of comparing these two, quite frankly, is TypeScript. How do you feel about it? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Because if you're in the Angular camp, probably going to have to use some TypeScript. React is a little more agnostic at this point. That could change. Maybe everybody will get on board. Maybe everybody will go the other way. Who knows? Ask yourself how you feel about churn. That's an important consideration here. Angular has at least publicly stated we're going to have breaking changes, potentially, every 6 months, which may sound bad until you consider React is a constantly moving target and may have breaking changes every couple of months. Who knows? May go 6 months without a change, and then all of a sudden a whole bunch of stuff changes. If you're big on web components, Angular supports that more easily. It's not to say you can't make React do that, but it's simpler with Angular. So React is going to have a little harder time moving in that direction. In the React camp, JSX is pretty normal. How do you feel about that? I like it because it gives me code completion. My IDE knows what it is. I don't have to deal with string templates where it goes, I don't know what you're trying to do. One thing I definitely appreciate about React is the fact that it wants to fail fast and give you a line number where you made a mistake. My sort of prototypical experience with Angular is I make a change, I hit refresh, and then my screen is blank. I have to try to figure out what I did wrong. So I appreciate that in many instances, React will get me pretty darn close to where I made my mistake. A lot of this fundamentally comes back to how do you feel about JavaScript versus HTML? Angular is very HTML-centric, and it's we're going to take the browser and take HTML in a whole new direction. React says, hey, JavaScript's pretty cool. We can do a lot of interesting stuff in JavaScript. So you have to ask yourself, which one makes more sense to you? There's no right or wrong answer here. Different people are going to have different opinions. Again, we just did a little to-do app at work, and we all kind of chose different front-end technologies, and a couple of us chose React and really felt like it sort of fit our hand better, fit our eye better, and just really struggled trying to do any of that stuff in Angular. Again, I'm sure if we spent 6 months on Angular, it'd be fine. But one of the examples I like to use with people is looping. How do you do a loop in React? It's JavaScript. You just use a JavaScript loop like you've used in every programming language ever since the beginning of your programming career. Angular says, don't worry, I have my own proprietary loop. You can just use that instead. And of course, they have a wonderful cheat sheet full of all sorts of things to help you with all their proprietary pieces. Now, some people like to talk about the size of frameworks and libraries, and we kind of go back and forth on when we do or don't care about that. Honestly, modern web apps today are going to be pretty large no matter what we do, so I wouldn't let this really sway you one way or the other. Fundamentally, guys, the only way you're going to know which one makes sense for you is a bake-off. You're going to have to try them. So give yourself a couple of weeks, whatever you can spare, and do a time-boxed eval. Do a couple of simple projects with either one, both of them, try to compare and contrast. What do you think makes sense? What does your team prefer? This is an important consideration. I haven't had a lot of luck in my career trying to dictate to developers. Developers are like cats. They will go in the opposite direction just on principle. You ask a cat to come here and it just walks away. We do the same thing as developers. Oh, you tell me I have to use this? Well, no, I'm not going to use that anymore then. I also advise you, though, don't be a lemming. So many people just sort of like run where everyone else is. That's not necessarily the right answer for you. If React works for you, that's great. Embrace it. If Angular works for you, that's great. Embrace it. Now, the other thing that I want to caution you against, quite frankly, is analysis paralysis. It's so easy to get into this world and think, oh my God, I'm going to make the wrong choice, and I don't want to make a mistake, and so I'm going to spend a whole bunch of time on this, and 6 months later, your customer's sitting there going, hey, when am I going to get my product? I'm still waiting on some business value being delivered. And one of the things that I've gotten very comfortable with as I've gotten older, don't worry about the choice you make today. Seriously. No matter what you choose, you're going to be wrong. Nature of the beast. You're not going to be wrong in the next 6 months, but over some time period, you're going to look back and go, well, we made a bad choice there. That's just how this industry works. Now, the same token I say that, understand that you're going to have to make the best decision you can for where you're at today and what makes sense for your projects today. I remember early on when I was very young, I bought a new computer, and 6 months later, a new computer came out, and it was twice as fast, had twice as much RAM, cost half as much, and I felt really bad about that. And one of my friends pointed out, but Nate, you needed a computer, right? If you wouldn't have bought that computer, you can constantly wait for the next thing, and then you're not getting any value in the time in between. So we could constantly wait for the next version, the next thing, and that's not going to help us deliver business value to our customers today. So we got to make the best choice we can with the information that's in front of us today and move forward knowing that, yep, at some point in the future, we'll be wrong, but that's okay. We'll adapt and adjust by then. I wish you luck. It's not an easy decision. Well, folks, thank you for spending some time with me. I really appreciate it. I'll be around all day. If you have questions or comments, feel free to grab me. I'm happy to have a conversation with you. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.